Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sacred to Secular podcast. I'm your host, Jack Adams, and I'm joined today by our guest, Anthony Miller. Hello, Anthony.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're super glad to have you on the podcast. I've got a little bit of a bio that I was going to read from our Thrive Day back in November of 2024 in Lehigh. Feel free to add anything after, but it says Anthony Miller has been a frequent podcast guest and speaker on topics related to faith crisis, community, relationships, and about life after deconstruction. He shared his personal story on Mormon Stories in August 2019, and in 2022, he shared his story as a TEDx talk with the title "Thriving and Building Community After a Faith Crisis." Anthony created and co-leads a Thrive support group called Mormon Spectrum in Yellowstone County in Billings, Montana, where he lives in a mixed faith marriage. Find Anthony on his Life After Deconstruction podcast on YouTube, Facebook, and your favorite podcast apps. So plenty of things that we can talk about, Anthony. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, that about covers it. I um, My background is I'm an educator, entrepreneur, own a financial planning practice that I've built over 30 years. Taught finance at our local private liberal arts college for about 7 years. And I'm semi-retired now. I split my time between Montana, Utah, and other places as well.
And you ride motorcycles, right?
Yes, motorcycles, Jeeps, rock buggies, bicycles, electric bicycles too, hike, all the outdoor things for sure.
It's a good thing you live in Billings then. It'd be a shame if you didn't do any of those things.
Okay, thanks.
So, Anthony, what was your religious background like, and what initially gave you the sense that something might need to change?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So my ancestors are all Mennonite, which is like a more conservative Anabaptist movement that started in like the 1500s. And my parents joined the church when I was 3 years old, and it was pretty heretical for all of our Mennonite family. My mother's father was the equivalent of a general authority in the Mennonite church,
Oh, wow.
and my father's father was an entrepreneur and a philanthropist that donated quite a bit of money and resources and time and so forth. And my parents held a fairly literalist view of scriptures, of biblical texts, and they had questions that they never felt like they got satisfying answers to in the Mennonite church. And so when I was 3 years old, they moved to the Phoenix area, and my mom decided what she'd do to find a babysitter is go to the local church and see if the pastor's daughter, babysat. And she walked in on a what we call now, I guess, a homemaking meeting, and she just thought that was great, and they invited her to stay and invited her to meet the missionaries. And within a couple months, they ended up joining the church because the answers that they wanted or that they were seeking, they felt like they found satisfying answers in the church. And so I was raised in the Phoenix area. Most of it was in Mesa, Arizona, in East Mesa, in the 70s and early 80s. And at that time, with convert parents and the kind of Mormonism that was fairly dominant at the time, it was a version of more literalist, Bruce R. McConkie, um, Ezra Taft Benson, Spencer W. Kimball, Boyd K. Packer kind of Mormonism that we grew up with. It was very literal, uh, literalist believing. And my parents also really liked Cleon Skousen stuff, and he was very conservative and literalist, and also kind of a right wing politician, politically. I never heard it called the John Birch Society, but I understand that Cleon Skousen affiliated with them as well. So that was the version of Mormonism that I grew up with. And it gave me a lot of structure, a lot of friends in Mesa, Arizona. About a third of the population was Latter day Saint. And so I went to release time seminary. Along the way, though, as I allude to in my TEDx talk, my father had a very difficult time providing for us. And so um, we would frequently get evicted from the places that we rented. We would frequently rely on the church for help with food and other kinds of things. And then by the time I was around 14 years old, my parents divorced, and my father still had a very difficult time providing for us. So I mowed lawns and delivered pizza as the oldest of four children, while my mother did sewing and alterations out of our home. And the church was really foundational for us. It gave me father figures that I didn't really have from my own father. It gave me hope of what a stable family could look like. Our family had Christmases because of the efforts of our ward. Um, and I had friends. It was just all very, very important. And then eventually I ended up serving my mission in Barcelona, Spain, where I really felt like I could really reinvent myself and decide who I wanted to be as a person. My mission was extremely helpful for me. I had many deep and abiding spiritual experiences, had some really amazing experiences in Barcelona, Spain that aren't typical for the typical person that served in Barcelona. We had lots of baptisms. I served in one ward for a total of 13 months. It was so much that when I left, they gave me a farewell, like a missionary farewell.
Yeah.
And the last area that I served ended up becoming a branch soon after I left, and then a ward, and then a stake. And many of the people that I taught and baptized, and like the ward missioner leader of the time, ended up becoming the stake president and things like that. So it really was foundational to who I became as a young man. Um, so when I came home from my mission, I was certain in my uh, beliefs. I said that I knew that the church was true based on the attributions of meaning that I had to my spiritual experiences. And so I attended what is now Utah Valley University for about a year, and then attended BYU and took institute classes and religion classes, and then met my wife, who grew up with a very different version of Mormonism than I did. But I didn't realize it until after my faith crisis, actually, how different they were. We married, finished our undergrads at Utah State, and then went to grad school at University of Utah. And then in 1996, we ended up moving to Billings, Montana, knowing that it was going to be a temporary stay because there wasn't a temple here. And within less than 12 months of us moving here, they announced there was going to be a temple. So patriarchal blessing promises could be fulfilled and all those kinds of things. So the church was really, it fit well for me as a linear, concrete thinker, as a person who was in many ways an extrovert who enjoyed teaching, as a professional entrepreneur type person. Like the church, I felt like was built, for people like me. And my wife had many opportunities to serve as well. And I spent years as an ordinance worker, had stake and ward callings, and planned my whole life so I could retire when I was 55 years old and go serve missions for the church for the rest of my life, because that's how I interpreted my patriarchal blessing.
Yeah.
So because I'm so analytical, I accumulated a very heavy shelf, things I set aside in faith that God would provide me further light and knowledge for them someday. But the meanings that I attributed to my spiritual experiences were so significant and so enmeshed with my sense of identity that I was able to prevent my shelves from crashing, until I was 49 years old and our son came out as gay. He was 22 at the time. And I couldn't metaphorically shelf the implications for him living a life with the emptiness of not having comprehensive love in his life.
Yeah.
And so I searched for resources online to how to support him. And somehow I stumbled across the gospel topics essays that evening in April 2016. And as I studied the essays, um, it was particularly the race and the priesthood essay, I recognized that um, there wasn't really discernment individually and collectively for a very long time, that spiritual experiences had meant something other than a reliable divine witness of truth for the brethren on the topic of the ban. Um, and in doing that, I also recognized that many of my spiritual experiences had confirmed the truthfulness of many partially and entirely false things. And that recognition is what crashed everything for me. It crashed my shelves. Um, and as I studied the essays, I perceived that there was some misleading and maybe even dishonest information in the essays. And I also recognized, because I was old enough to remember 1993, um, that there, with the September 6th, and there was a period of time where there was a lot of church discipline and excommunication of historians that published about things that were in the essays, that I was told were anti-Mormon lies, and that's why they were excommunicated, and that violated my values, that historians would be disciplined for publishing things that now the church is acknowledging in the essays. And so that was my faith crisis, but the church worked extraordinarily well for me. What I found out, though, um, is that my wife grew up with a totally different version of Mormonism.
Sure.
And in one of our local Mormon Spectrum meetups, there's a couple that's now in their late 60s, maybe early 70s. And one time when we did a meetup, they said, our faith transition happened over a much longer period of time. But we didn't have an experience just like yours because we were David O. McKay Mormons. I'm like, what do you mean a David O. McKay Mormon? Well, when David O. McKay was president of the church, there wasn't as much, overloaded truth cart, black and white claims. The bishop of the ward kind of was like the father of the ward. There weren't the same kind of worthiness interviews. It just was a different church when David O. McKay was president of the church. The husband expressed that he remembers when he was younger talking to his Catholic friends saying, you'd have to go to confess to your priest. Like, if I need to repent, I can go straight to God. I don't have to go through a man, kind of thing. And I'm
Yeah.
like, what? Like, what is this? Like, because I thought that the version of Mormonism that I knew, that was the correlated version, that was the more orthodox McConkie, Hinckley, Packer, Benson type Mormonism, was the true version. And I remember going home after that meetup and sharing this with my wife, and she's like, "Oh, I'm totally a David O. McKay Mormon." And I'm like, "What? How can you be a David O. McKay Mormon?" She says, "Well, my parents were David O. McKay Mormons, and they raised me as a David O. McKay Mormon." And she's like, "We didn't have McConkie's Mormon doctrine in our home, and my parents warned me about Cleon, staying away from anything from Cleon Skousen, and sometimes we would watch General Conference and sometimes we wouldn't. And when my mom was Relief Society president, my dad had callings, like, they did it. They were very faithful, but it was a very different version of Mormonism." And that was very insightful, that in many ways ended up helping our mixed faith marriage. But
Yeah.
in any event, so that was my experience in the church, and that's what brought me up to my collapse of belief. So,
Yeah, it was this really nice Mormon narrative that you had set up for yourself. The church seemed to have impacted you in many really important ways in your life, and you were ticking all of the boxes. I mean, you can never fully measure up to what you need to do, but it seemed like you were doing everything right.
I mean, I was on the right track. Like, I was in high council by the time I was in my early 30s. I was high priest group leader uh, by the time I was 40. Um, so I was on the right track. My stake president told me that I would for sure be a bishop someday.
Yeah.
Um, and when I had my faith crisis, I was seeding a Spanish speaking branch for our stake in our ward. So
Mm.
all the native Spanish speakers would come to our ward. I would translate with other people. We would translate sacrament meeting, and then we would take turns teaching gospel essentials in Spanish. And then I would translate, and other people would help translate in priesthood meeting. And the idea was that we were going to baptize enough so that we could establish a Spanish speaking branch, which actually ended up happening a couple of years ago. Um, so that was the trajectory.
Yeah.
And being an entrepreneur, a financial planner, provided me the capacity to have more control of my schedule so that I could do more of these service things, be it
Oh,
an ordinance worker on Friday mornings, or plan my life so I could retire when I was 55 to go serve missions. But
yeah.
it was so because it worked so well for me, and because it was so enmeshed with my identity, it made it substantially more painful when it all collapsed on me.
Yes. This was obviously very deep and meaningful to you in your life. It seems like it was very integral to who you were as a person at this point in your life. And if it was so much a part and enmeshed with who you were as a person, what is it that makes you feel like you can't continue down this path that you were on?
Yeah. Um, well, I had an existential crisis basically. When I recognized that my most treasured spiritual experiences had been something other than the meanings that I attributed to them, um, I lost God in those moments. I used the term that I learned from Gina Colvin, that God left the corner of the room where I always knew him. And it was traumatic because those were very treasured experiences and things, um, where the meaning collapsed on me, and my trust in the brethren collapsed because I felt like the essays were not honest, and in many places, and that um, church discipline of scholars and historians was to try to protect faith, that it violated my core values with regard to honesty and integrity. And so I experienced a complete existential crisis because I didn't even know who I was anymore, because my whole life was all enmeshed with these meanings. So, I mean, what opened me up was that I couldn't shelf the implications of my son being gay, but what collapsed my belief was studying the church's gospel topics essays. And it was over, I mean, some people, they say when they read difficult church history, they find something that violates their values, whether it's how polygamy came to be, or that things just don't make sense for them anymore. Like, when they learn about the book of Abraham, or when they study the accounts of the first vision and they realize that the traditional narrative doesn't work because after 18 later than 1820, Joseph's mother and daughter joined the Presbyterian Church, and he studied to become a Methodist exhorter after 1820. So if there was a first vision theophany type of event, it couldn't have happened before 1823, and it maybe even happened later than that. And so some people read those kinds of things, and that's what triggers that doesn't make sense to them. For me, it was a recognition that spiritual experiences were something other than the meaning that I attributed to them, for me and for the brethren. So, where a lot of people will try to go to apologetics to make sense of things, um, I couldn't find apologetics to answer the question as to why mantles of discernment didn't work with the ban and there wasn't intervention from God. and I couldn't find apologetics to explain why I had spiritual witnesses of things that weren't true. I just couldn't find apologetics for that. And my bishop and my stake president and other people that I talked to, they didn't have any answers for that as either. So it was a little bit different than a lot of my friends that have gone through a faith transition. It was really pivotally about what our spiritual experience is for me.
Yes, I really like this idea. When you lead your support group, would you say that there's always some sort of inciting event that starts the deconstruction process? For example, for you, your son coming out as gay. For me and my wife, we had several events that kind of began our deconstruction. Would you say that it's pretty common for people in your group that are on the Mormon spectrum of faith to have some sort of inciting event like we're talking about?
Yeah, so I've seen both. For example, one member of our group served his mission uh, in, was it Independence or Nauvoo? I think he served it in the Nauvoo or Independence area. And his mission president allowed him to go study primary sources on P Day.
Oh, wow.
And so he started losing his faith on his mission. And he's close to 40 now, maybe he's 41 or 42. And his with it was a death of 1,000 cuts. And he did the nuanced Mormonism thing. He served on the High Council as a non-literal believer.
Mm.
And he shared with me imagery of the idea that if you had a book that over time individual pages turn to dust because they don't work anymore, and eventually you have a cover with nothing inside. And then he said, eventually for me, the binding to the book crumbled and floated away as dust, which was his personal attribution of meaning to what God is.
Mm.
And it took him 20 years, maybe 18 years probably,
Wow.
to get to that point. So that's excruciating to have happen over a very long period of time. We have others in our group. We have someone she served her mission at the Kirtland sites. And it took her well over a decade for it all to collapse on her until she couldn't do the nuanced Mormonism thing anymore. But so I think it'd be hard to say. I think, I mean, my guess, this is just speculation, and I don't really have a random sample or anything, but I would say as much as 1 in 4 of the people in our support group, it happened over a very long, extended period of time. And then for the other 3 and 4, probably half of them, there were some other issues that let them be open to unpacking difficult things like LGBTQ issues or women's issues, or like when the SEC fine came out, or Ensign Peak information was released, or when how the church handles abuse information came out. There was like some other trigger that made them feel more open to unpacking the rest of the stuff. So I think it's a spectrum. I think more often than not over the last decade, that church history issues has probably been one of the primary things, more for men than women, but also for women too, from what I've seen. And then LGBTQ and women's issues and other kinds of issues have played a significant role as well. But like, there's one guy in our group, he lost his faith studying biblical scholarship and lost God studying biblical scholarship before he lost Mormonism.
So, what was the implication of this faith crisis, and what was the most difficult emotional thing that you had to deal with?
Yeah. I mean, part of it was the feeling of disassociation, depression, grief, not knowing who I was anymore. Part of it was fear of what would happen to my marriage, my friendships, and my community, all my sense of identity, my roles, my reputation, my family connections were um, enmeshed with the church. Um, Part of it was what am I gonna do with my life, because I was going to retire and serve missions. Like, so now what?
Yeah.
Um, um, but the way my mind works is I just really felt like I needed to. The implications were an anxious sense of needing to find answers to reconcile things, because I did have treasured experiences that I didn't want to throw the, they say it like, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing.
Sure.
Like, let's get rid of the bathwater, but like there's some babies in there. Like, so what do I do with treasured experiences that I had? And what do I do to continue to have those kinds of experiences in my life, even if I don't have literal belief? Um, so it was all encompassing. One of the hardest days probably was, I mean, there were several really, really hard days, but one of the hardest days was um, I had I had started on Year of Polygamy, and I was reading In Sacred Loneliness, and I was reading Rough Stone Rolling, and I was learning about the history of polygamy and how the temple came to be, and the history behind Doctrine and Covenants 132. Um, and that initially the temple was mostly, not 100%, but mostly related to plural marriage. Um, and celestial marriage was essentially synonymous, or was understood to be essentially synonymous with plural marriage. And understanding the context of how DNC 132 came to be, and then remembering all my experiences of years being an ordinance worker, and the things that I learned and that were unique and different, where all of a sudden I could see polygamy completely enmeshed in the temple. Um, and I sat down and read all of DNC 132 in one sitting, realizing, having understood all the context of it, and I recognized that what that was had nothing to do with my marriage. And I love my wife immensely, and that was extraordinarily painful to come to the recognition that all the meanings that I attributed to my eternal marriage, uh, they weren't real. They were based on something that actually I had concluded was uh, abusive, with plural marriage and how it came to be. That was an extremely painful day.
Yeah, that's quite the feat, sitting down and reading D&C 132 in one sitting. I imagine that was pretty painful given the new context that you had around that chapter. So moving, I guess, a little bit into your TED talk, you had mentioned that spiritual experiences that you had in the church were like vines growing around and eventually growing into your heart. You were using those spiritual experiences to assign meaning and value to your life. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you meant by that?
Yeah, I was trying to communicate. I wanted to walk people through the experience of how much I loved Mormonism, how I attributed meaning to spiritual experiences, what I meant by spiritual experiences, and how it became enmeshed with my identity. And so, um, uh, bouncing ideas off of one of my friends, uh, I came up with this idea to express that the meanings that I attributed to my spiritual experiences, um, and my attributions of meaning to God and things like that were as if metaphorical vines that I interlaced around my heart. And the more that I had, and the more that I had serendipitous experiences that happened during my life, and the more that I had spiritual experiences that were deeply meaningful, the more vines there were that interlaced around my heart. And then they eventually grew into my heart. And then over time, they became one with my heart. So they were completely enmeshed with my very sense of identity. Um, so it wasn't like joining a gym or something. You know, it wasn't a social club to me. It was totally enmeshed in my very existential sense of identity and existence. And then my faith crisis, I express in my TED talk that it's as if all those metaphorical vines that had grown into my heart and become one with my heart were abruptly and violently ripped from my heart, leaving my heart a bloody, tangled mess. That was the experience of the collapse of identity and God leaving the corner of the room where I knew him and having all these decades of attribution of meaning that became enmeshed with my identity acutely and abruptly and violently ripped from me. And the feedback that I've got from my TED talk is that uh, that kind of metaphor tracks for people. So it did what I intended for it to do.
Yeah, it's really beautiful imagery having these vines enmeshed with your sense of being and then the violence that occurs when those are ripped away. I recently had a friend tell me a story of his father watched some Facebook video about Francis Scott Key, the writer of the national anthem, and it was a really beautifully done Facebook video. And he was weeping when watching it. And then he actually came to realize after the fact that 85, 90, 95% of the video was completely made up. So he was having this spiritual experience about something that was almost entirely false. You mentioned that there are things like this for you in Mormonism. You've already mentioned polygamy. I'm curious if there are any others that come to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there were several foundational pieces to my testimony. And I don't know if a quarter of my testimony was foundationally had to do with the idea that Mormon attribution of meaning to priesthood was true, that it was a literal restoration of what existed when Jesus was on earth, and and that and that there were special mantles of discernment that corresponded with um, stewardship and responsibility. So, for example, uh, things like if a bishop has keys for the ward, priesthood keys for the ward, um, one one of the keys or results of his stewardship and responsibility of his priesthood calling as the bishop is he's supposed to have extra levels of discernment with regard to what happens in his ward. And so the model is if there's confusion about an answer to prayer or about a doctrinal matter or something like that in a ward, the bishop is considered a judge in Israel, where you can go to the bishop and say, "Hey, I received this sense of answer to prayer, but I want to counsel with you about it," or something like that. And the bishop is supposed to have this extra mantle of discernment. And my patriarchal blessing talks about the gift of discernment as a spiritual gift, in addition to it being a priesthood gift. And the maybe quarter of my testimony was about this dynamic where when there was divine appointment, that those who had keys had extra discernment from God that was related to their calling. That doesn't mean that Elder Ballard could like time the stock market or something like that, or that uh, President Oakes could figure out when to lock in a mortgage on his house or something like that, because that doesn't really have anything to do with a specific uh, responsibility and authority related to his divine appointment of his calling.
Sure.
But if my bishop or my stake president is acting within the limits of their calling, um, and they're worthy, um, that God provides them additional revelation and discernment related to their calling. So my bishop and then stake president for a good part of my mission was F. Michael Watson, because my father and stepmother lived in Bountiful, where Michael lived. And Michael was the secretary to the first presidency for a very, very long time. He was actually secretary to the Quorum of the 12 before he was secretary to the first presidency, for more than 20 years, maybe 26 years. And so I went and visited him in the church administration building. And I heard stories about his interactions with the first presidency. He was the one that used to read the statistical report before
Doing that.
yeah, they stopped doing that. So I had that access to um, uh, that was more indirect access to the brethren through F. Michael Watson. And then also after my mission, my first bishop in the Salt Lake area when we were in grad school at University of Utah was Ron Rasband. And
Wow.
he was pretty close with Elder Ballard. And Elder Ballard's son, Craig Ballard, was in our ward. And I ended up becoming pretty good friends over time with Craig Ballard. And we even worked on potentially doing some business ventures together. And so I spent time not only with Craig and his wife, but I spent time in Elder Ballard's home. Uh, and I spent time with Elder Ballard and Craig in the church administration building. And so not only was it the things that were taught to me in correlated Mormonism and by my mission president and through the scriptures about stewardship, responsibility, divine appointment, and keys, but I had these personal experiences and exposure to the brethren, including through F. Michael Watson and including Elder Ballard. So I had an extremely strong testimony with spiritual experiences that while Elder Ballard was a grandpa and a former auto dealer and a desire to be an entrepreneur and live vicariously through his kids, I also had an extraordinarily strong sense of spiritual witness that he also had divine appointment, so that when he was acting within the realm of his specific calling, he was speaking for God. So in Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verse 38, it expresses something that gets proof texted and manipulated quite a bit. But basically, what often gets expressed is that whether it comes through my voice or the voice of my servants, it's the same. It's as if it comes through me. And so that's the attribution of meaning that I had to that verse, that when they were speaking with the Spirit within the limits of their stewardship and responsibility, that it was as if God was speaking. Um, uh, and the way that I attributed meaning to that as well is there was a little bit of nuance in it. And that when I served my mission in Spain, when I would give a blessing or confirm someone a member of the church, doing a priesthood ordinance, I often would sense uh, inspiration. And then I found myself having to find the words in Spanish to say it. And sometimes I felt like I was given words, but other times I felt like, God doesn't speak English or Spanish. God speaks to my soul with inspiration. And then I have to try to fallibly find words to express it. So the way that I made sense of some of my questions were influenced by that, where, you know, a patriarch or a general authority or a bishop can sense inspiration, and they have to frame it through their fallible human way. But sometimes God gives them direct words, because I thought that's what happened with me. Anyway, so that was a significant part of my testimony. Like I said, maybe a quarter. Like the atonement was part of it, and scriptures were part of it, and my attribution of meaning to the Book of Mormon was part of it. So
Wow.
when I read the Race of the Priesthood essay, and I recognized that Joseph ordained blacks to the priesthood, that there never actually was a revelation uh, requiring the ban, and I read the cited source speeches to footnote number 9. So footnote number 9 in the Race and the Priesthood essay, in the paragraph, it expresses um, that Brigham Young foresaw that black members of the church would have all the blessings of the priesthood and more. And then there's footnote number 9. I'm like, I had never heard that before. So I go follow footnote number 9, and I go to the cited sources speeches. And there's 2 speeches that are cited for that footnote. One of the 2 speeches, the longer one, was given by Brigham Young the very day after Brigham Young announced and had established through the legislature Utah as an official slave territory. And he announced legal slavery in Utah, and it was God ordained, and blacks should be grateful for it. In the talk, he refers to Adam God doctrine, blood atonement.
Have you heard of those things before? Or is this opening up other
Those were all
tangents?
anti-Mormon lies, right? That I
Yeah.
had shelved, right?
Yeah.
Because Bruce McConkie claimed that Brigham didn't teach blood atonement or Adam God doctrine, and I believed Elder McConkie. And there's some really horrifically racist things and disavowed doctrine in that second speech. I think it's from February 2nd, 1852. And in the speech, he talks about blacks having wide noses and bigger lips, and that is a result of the curse, including dark skin. And in the speech, he expresses that at the end of the restitution of all things, and after all the sons of Abel, which could mean all the literal lineal descendants of Abel, or those that would have been born by Abel if Cain hadn't killed Abel, which again, that was a problem, because I recognize that the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel couldn't be actually literal history, because math and DNA and stuff.
Okay.
But he expresses that after all the sons of Adam, at the end of the restitution of all things, and after all the sons of Abel have first received the opportunity of the priesthood, then blacks would receive the opportunity of the priesthood and more, and the curse would be taken from them. And the way he expresses it in that speech, it seems like he's saying that they will become white at that time. So it seems like he was saying this was at the end of the millennium, after all the resurrections, everything, then blacks would receive the priesthood and become white. And in the essay, it leads the reader to believe that Brigham Young foresaw 1978 and would have approved it. But when I read that speech, I'm like, that is absolutely not what Brigham Young was expressing. And I recognize that individually and collectively, pretty much all of the brethren, not 100%, but close to it, for more than 125 years, didn't have discernment. They had spiritual experiences to which they attributed meaning regarding the curse. They taught it as doctrine. It was very clearly expressed to be doctrine. Um, Not only the reasons for the ban, but the ban itself was God ordained, and and they harmed people in the name of God, and God never intervened. And because I attributed so much of my testimony to this idea of special priesthood, divine appointment, and things like that, um, it wasn't just that they were racist. It's that there weren't really mantles of discernment. There really wasn't divine appointment. There wasn't discernment individually and collectively for more than 125 years. Um, and I mean, that was a big enough leg of my testimony that when that fell, um, it collapsed the others. It also made me realize, well, if they don't have discernment, what about my spiritual experiences? And then I had shelved times when my spiritual experiences had corresponded with partially and entirely false things. And as I read the other essays, there were things in the essays that I recognized that they weren't true, but I had spiritual experiences that corresponded with to them. And I taught Sunday school and I bore testimony and I prayed about those things, and they just weren't true. So I mean, again, that was the real trigger, is recognizing those things.
That makes sense. When this was ripped out of your heart, what was that mental and emotional experience like?
Yeah, I mean, originally when I wrote my TED talk, I was going to describe that I experienced suicidal ideation and disassociation.
Yeah.
And instead of saying that, I walked people through it in my TED talk with words like, I didn't feel like myself, like a hollow person. I didn't fully recognize the person in the mirror. Or my mind, the pain, I was in the middle of a panic attack, but I didn't call it a panic attack. My heart was racing. I was in so much pain that my mind instantly hatched a plan of how to end the pain without leaving a mess for my wife so she wouldn't have to sell her home. So I walked people through that kind of pain and grief. The grief, the processing of the grief took, I would say, 12 to 18 months with a lot of support from support communities, from going to the Salt Lake City Sandstone Symposium, from finding local people that had gone through what I had gone um, through reading Brene Brown, learning a lot about grief and processing grief. The grief took 12 to 18 months. It was at least 12 months before I was not in the stage of anger with frequency. It took about 18 months before I think I was at a level of acceptance stage of grief most of the time. But it really took 3 years before I really started to feel like myself again. I would say even 5 years before I fully felt like myself again, just because there was so much to unpack and process.
Wow.
There's a suggestion that it takes 1 year for every decade of full Orthodox belief to process, and I was 49 when it collapsed on me. So sometimes I wish I had gone through it a lot younger. But then I would have been navigating a mixed faith marriage with minor children. Mm-hmm. And so would that have been better? I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, maybe it's one of those serendipitous things that happened when it did.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly had more time to consume, process information, and find communities and people to help me. Uh, it, it would have been harder if I was earlier in my career to do that, for sure.
I don't think anyone that has experienced religious orthodoxy like you have would describe the deconstruction process as anything besides extremely painful. What advice would you give to someone who is going through their dark night of the soul, as you described it in your TED Talk?
Um, I mean, the primary things that I would share is to hold grace for yourself, um, to realize that this is going to take time, and it feels like you're sinking in quicksand, but you're actually standing on solid ground. And
What do you mean by that?
I mean, in the midst of it, in existential crisis, in the midst of it, people feel like, not everyone, but it's common to feel like I've lost my moral framework. I don't know what anything means anymore. I made all my life's decisions, through this lens, and now the lens doesn't work anymore. Um, I my marital relationship was all based on this. How I raised my kids was all based on this. Um, so it feels very unmooring, or destabilizing, or like you're sinking in quicksand, and that you're grasping out, trying to make sense of everything at once. And at least for me, and I think it's common for a lot of people to binge a significant amount of content to make sense of things as they're going through it. Maybe they try to make some form of Christianity work, or maybe they try to make apologetics work for them. Um, maybe maybe the way they're processing the grief is they decide it's time to test all the behavioral boundaries that the rest of the world does when they're in college.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it's any number or combination of things, and I think the biggest thing that I would express is a lot of times people who are processing those things don't realize that what they're experiencing is grief. That's what the anger is. That's what the sorrow and the sadness, the sense of betrayal, the depression, it's grief because you lost something that you loved. Um, and part of what you loved might have been yourself,
Mhm.
or the version of yourself that you knew. And if your experiences was like mine, where God left the corner of the room that I knew him metaphorically, uh, and never returned to that corner, it was like I lost more than my best friend, uh, because of what my relationship with God was, the way I attributed meaning to God. And it was so traumatic that I don't know how often other people experience this, but I expressed it to a certain extent in my TED talk. Is that um, when all the vines and layers of meaning were ripped from my heart, and I experienced this severe grief, and the attribution of meaning that I had to God left as if it never existed. It was so traumatic for my being that I stopped feeling the spirit. I stopped having spiritual experiences because um, I think because it was just so traumatic for me.
Yeah.
And as my heart healed over time, and as I processed the grief, I began once more to sense um, a spiritual connection in my being once more. And it was too triggering to call it God when it happened, but it was so good
Yeah.
to feel. connection and awe and wonder and and compassion and love and goodness and all of those kinds of things that I attributed meaning to as the spirit in in before my faith crisis. But it took some time of healing before I could experience that again. It took
Yeah.
over 3 months to get to that point with a lot of help and support.
I really resonate with this idea of seeking solid ground and then realizing that you might already be standing on it. What was it for you that made you realize that you were actually at a solid starting place?
I mean, I used tools just because I'm so analytical. I used entrepreneurial tools. And when Lindsay Hansen Park used those words and told me, she was the first person I met in person and told my full story. She's the executive director of Sunstone and the creator of the Year of Polygamy podcast.
Yeah.
Um, she asked me what I was doing, and I shared with her what I was doing. And that's when she expressed to me that you're standing on solid ground. And basically, what I was doing was I was considering my internal core values, my moral values. I got up early in the morning. Um, my faith crisis happened on was triggered on April 29th, 2016. In May, I started getting up at like 5:30 in the morning, and I would go on long walks and I would listen to books or music or uh, apologetics or podcasts, all of the above. And I was out in nature. And so um, I was doing something that was getting me out and moving in nature and in contemplation. I was seeking out opportunities to serve people without realizing it, because a lot of my spiritual experiences corresponded with service to others and feeling like I was led or guided to help certain people, or that I experienced God in my service to others. And so without realizing it, that I was seeking out opportunities to serve other people. Um, I couldn't listen to church music anymore, but there was other kinds of music that I started listening to that was very centering to me. So I was doing work to find things that provided me a sense of awe and connection and grounding as a believer, to which I attributed meaning to God. And I was, without realizing it, I mean, I later realized it, is that all the core activities and things that gave me a sense of spirit as a believer, it's the same after.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's probably not church music, but there's music that's very centering to me. Um, Contemplation. It's not prayer, but it's meditative practices, hiking, walking, um, guided meditation, things like that, service to others, um, those kinds of things. So, so the standing on solid ground, I think part of that is to recognize that you actually are the same person, even though it feels like you don't know who you are. You're actually the same person, and the kinds of activities uh, and efforts that brought you a sense of connection and awe and meaning and a sense of spirituality, um, those things are still going to be the things that are going to give you that sense of connection and meaning and purpose. And you might call it spirit, or you might not. You might call it awe, or you might call it something else. Um, so the reason you're on solid ground is actually it's the same stuff. that it was before.
Really like this idea of pulling traditional wisdom from religion without the dogma associated to it. But how do I stop assigning meaning to things? Like I always remember thinking, I was in this exact right place at the exact right time so that I could serve this specific person. How does one stop doing that?
Yeah. So early on, I had multiple people tell me that I needed to study the secular application of Buddhist principles.
Mm,
And I was very uncomfortable because I thought, isn't Buddhism another religion? And in Mormonism, other religions, Satan could have something to do with it. And so I was conditioned to try to avoid those kinds of things. But I eventually chose to follow that. So I started listening to the Secular Buddhism podcast. Um, Several people suggested that I read Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth. I found Jack Cornfield, who has an audio program called Buddhism for Beginners. And as I started studying the secular application of Buddhist principles, I found tools uh, to apply to those things so I didn't feel anxious to attribute meaning to things. So, like, one Buddhist principle is you don't know the meaning of something when it happens. You can't.
yeah.
It's going to happen later and over time, and it might change, and that's okay. Um, or there's a story in Buddhism of the farmer's son, and I'll probably slaughter it, but it goes something like this: that the farmer's son was away for a time, and he comes, and the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, that's so great that your son came back." And the farmer says, "Oh, who knows what is good or what is bad?" And then the next day, a horse shows up, and the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, what? How fortunate that a horse showed up!" And the farmer says, "Who knows what is good or what is bad?" And then the next day, the son is riding the horse and falls off, and he breaks his leg. And the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, what a terrible thing that your son broke his leg." And the farmer says, "Well, who knows what is good or what is bad?" And then the next day, the military comes to, because of the subscription, they were going to take the son away to war where he would certainly die, and he can't go because he has a broken leg. And the neighbor says, "Oh, how fortunate, uh, and then the neighbor says something like, "I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, who knows what is good or what is bad." So the idea is we don't know. We can just live in it, and we can approach things with a sense of curiosity and gratitude for the happening. And it can be a painful thing like a broken leg, but maybe that ends up being the fortunate thing, because then you don't get sent off to war because you broke your leg. You just don't know. So there are lots of things in the secular application of Buddhist principles that were super helpful tools for me. It helped those kinds of resources were probably among the most significant to help me move beyond dualistic binary thinking where everything is right or everything is wrong or everything is good or everything, it's the church of Jesus or the church of the devil, or
Yeah.
kind of thing. And I think I think there's a propensity for people who are dualistic thinkers to really thrive in Mormonism because a lot of the messaging is dualistic. Um, and then when they experience a faith crisis, the dualistic thinking just continues. They just flip it, the other way.
Yeah.
Um, but that's not helpful for relationships, and that's not helpful for processing uh, our past experiences. And so the Buddhist principles, studying those, contemplating those, listening to books, uh, reading and listening to Brene Brown and other kinds of people helped me increase my capacity to move beyond dualistic thinking. and to not rush to attribute meaning to things, to just sit with the curiosity and with gratitude.
Yeah, I think you talked about this in your TED talk too, how you can just have an experience and let that experience exist in its pure form without having to assign any meaning to it.
A few of my friends that are contemplative mystic types really appreciated that,
Sure.
because that, as human beings, we're always trying to find patterns. It seems like that's how we're conditioned or built to make sense of things, and I think we miss a lot by not just approaching things with gratitude and curiosity, and not feeling like we need to rush to attribute meaning to things. I mean, there's this saying, everything happens for a reason. It's because we make up reasons to, to
Yeah.
assign to those things. And it could be random. It could be, the reason could be evolution, or it can be serendipity, or it could be all sorts of things. Uh, and it's okay if we don't know what they are.
It seems to me like this type of thinking could really help people process things like death, impermanence, uncertainty about an afterlife. Because to me, it seems like dualistic thinking and being really, really concerned about death kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, I mean, I got this from is it Ricky Gervais, the comedian?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and I don't know where he got it from, but basically, in a series that he was in, somebody asked him, "Doesn't isn't life meaningless if you don't know that you're going to live after you die or go to heaven or something like that?" And he said, "Have you ever watched a movie?" And she's like, "Yeah." And he's like, the movie is going to end, right? So do you say, "Oh, the movie's going to end, I might as well just quit"? No, because
Not
I want to
sure.
see the rest of the movie. And
Yeah.
he's like, "That's how I feel about life. I know that someday my life will end. I don't I don't know what happens after we die. Um, but I want to watch the rest of the movie
Yeah.
because it's pretty amazing. And if it ends tomorrow, it ends, or maybe it lasts longer. But the wonder, or the and Eckhart Tolle refers to these kinds of things too in his book A New Earth, and in The Power of Now as well, that the eternal life, the real deepest meaning, is in the present. It's in that next scene of the movie,
Yeah.
and then the next scene.
The show you're referencing is called Afterlife. It's on Netflix and it's kind of a comedic look at all of this stuff. I would definitely highly recommend it to anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Death is a big one for someone to unpack. There's Carl Sagan's wife. I feel bad that I don't remember her name. Anne. Her name is Anne. But you can Google search a
Yeah, yeah.
quote from Carl Sagan's wife after he died, and she expresses, it's very helpful to read. She expresses that people asked her before Carl Sagan died, um, did he change his beliefs about the afterlife? And she said, no, he didn't. Um, but of all of the potential possibilities of existence in the universe and existence, what we did have is we had a period of time that we were together, and we treasured those things, and that made everything worth it. Those kind of, I can't even do justice for it, but you should Google search her quote about death, and whether Carl Sagan changed his beliefs right before he died, and he
Sure.
didn't. Yeah, yeah, that's a big one. Moral frameworks are a big one. So internal introspection to figure out what actually are your moral values. Um, some people become nihilists, so nothing means anything. And if they combine that with depression of a faith crisis and testing behavioral boundaries, they can get themselves into trouble.
Sure.
Um, uh, and so, I mean, it's kind of a work of reconstruction of trying to figure out what are my values, what matters to me, what helps me feel a sense of awe and connection and meaning and purpose, and and uh, how do I increase my capacity to not have anxiety about ambiguity, but approach things with curiosity and gratitude in the present.
Yeah.
And how do I go through all those things? Those are all things to unpack. And I also suggest that uh, what a faith transition does is expose a marriage. It exposes what already existed in a marriage. And there might have been underlying things that weren't fully addressed. They were glossed over because of a shared belief or belief that we'll figure this difficulty out in the next life. So it's too disruptive to try to figure out this thing in this life. It'll be fine. We'll just figure it out in the next life or things like that. And so I suggest that a faith transition exposes the underlying marriage that already existed, and it gives us an opportunity to put in work to renegotiate the marriage and harvest the parts of it that make sense for us. And for some people, that means the marriage doesn't survive the faith transition, and that can be okay. But I think in many cases, the marital relationship can actually get significantly stronger with more vulnerability and more gratitude and more honesty and transparency. Um, because because if today is my last day with my wife and there is no afterlife, or I don't know that there's an afterlife, like I'm going to approach that differently. I'm going to approach that differently because maybe it's my last meal. Maybe it's a treasured moment that I get to share, a gift of a relationship and existence. And hopefully I get to do it again tomorrow and next week and the next month, but we don't ever know. And I think approaching things like that can help strengthen relationships. Um, so there's just a lot of work when Richard Rohr calls it your first half of life. When your first half of life has all this structure and attribution of meaning and it's fairly rigid and developmentally it worked for you and then it all falls apart. It takes some work. There's
Yeah.
not just like a plug and play
Yeah.
to to fix it. And everybody's answers are going to be just a little bit different based on, and they might not be static. So the way I view things today are different than I viewed things when I did my Mormon Stories interview 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So, and that's okay that it changes.
Knowing what I now know about ex-religious people is those rigid and static frameworks don't work anymore. We're allergic to prescriptions. And so I think it's that way a little bit by design.
Yeah, there's this dynamic that I see that it's common that we don't want to be told what to do because we feel burnt and betrayed by
Yeah.
people that we trusted. Uh, and then at the same time, what's ironic is we tend to seek out new prophets.
Yeah, like John Dehlin.
Yeah, and some of them are prophets, but
Yeah.
in a different, Brene Brown's a prophet, but in a
Yeah.
different way, and Eckhart Tolle's a prophet in a different way, and so in the end, we need to realize, I think, that we need to claim our own authority,
Mhm.
um, and we can harvest things from the work of others, but in the end, it's our journey, and the model of deferring to a prophet, ultimately, it's not helpful.
All right. So landing the plane a little bit here. And again, really appreciate your time, Anthony. It seems like community played a really big role in your journey for finding purpose and meaning. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, community was a huge part of it. I mean, initially it was, I felt like I was going insane. And so I needed to find people that I could talk to that could at least hold space for what I was experiencing, or that maybe had walked the journey themselves, and so that I could have the confidence that there was light on the other side. Um, Part of my need for community was to have someone to process information with. So in psychology, there's something called active listening, where a therapist or a psychiatrist, psychologist um, sits and listens and asks questions to the patient, um, and without dictating to the patient, what they need to do, but they're actively listening to it, and that has a significant impact on processing grief and trauma, actually. And there are other groups that help people do that, particularly um, when there's a sense of unconditional love or acceptance, even if when people, even holding grace for people that screw up. So like there's Alcoholic Anonymous kind of thing, or there are grief support groups for people who have lost a spouse, or for children that have lost a parent. And active listening is part of that. And Brene Brown refers to these things uh, as ministering presence and holding the hands of strangers. And so, community for people processing a sense of trauma or grief or betrayal, um, it's extraordinarily difficult to do it on your own without someone that's participating in active listening to catch them to where they feel accepted, validated, and loved, um, without agendas. Um, Support groups can be based on trauma bonding, and that can serve a purpose for a period of time.
Sure.
Um, but my view is, if a support community or support relationship is solely based on trauma bonding, that's just a developmental stage and it's not a long-term thing. And that can be okay. There are support groups that come and go, um, because everybody goes through and processes it, and then they maintain some friendships or relationships, but the group kind of disperses because the trauma bonding is over. Um, and then there are other groups where um, they can have a particular identity. So, like in my Thrive presentation, I expressed that when I was in my dark night of the soul, I needed someone to catch me.
Mm.
And so I found people that caught me, and that was very healing. So I could feel a sense of awe and spiritual connection and things like that again. And so that I could process my grief. And I knew that I needed to create something that like that locally, and that I needed to be a part of it. At least that's what I felt drawn to do. And so I created a group, the Mormon Spectrum Yellowstone County group, where our identity is primarily surrounding we catch people. That's what we do. And some people come and they go. Some people don't need to be caught anymore, but they find value in participating in catching of others. And so it's more than just a trauma bonding experience. Um, and to a certain extent, the best parts of Mormonism we can manifest in a group like that. Because the best parts of Mormonism, I think, include where we catch people when they're in a time of need, whether it's the family whose kid got in an auto accident, or the widows whose house burnt down, or the family, that wouldn't have a Christmas if it weren't for the ward, kind of thing. And I think we can continue to do that. And I think that can be helpful. And I think then there are other, in my Thrive presentation, I referred to a group that I've joined called Ex Moto. It's a Marco Polo group. There's 17 of us in the group, and it's a bunch of post Mormon men who like riding motorcycles.
Yeah.
and we go on trips together, and we have a Marco Polo group, and we talk about more than just motorcycles, but we also talk a lot about motorcycles, and we'll go on motorcycle rides, multiple day rides, afternoon rides, things like that. Um, and that hobby, or that shared myth, a connecting story, provides a sense of ongoing community. And it's different than Mormonism, because Mormonism is usually prescribed. Like, we're going to prescribe who your friends are, because we're going to assign ministering brothers and sisters, and then we're going to put you in these callings so that you're going to work with other people in an auxiliary presidency or something like that. And it's more, and then the ward is going to do, and the stake is going to do these different service projects and so forth. It's prescribed. And post faith transition, it's not.
Oh.
You have to put in work, or some extrovert has to put in work. Actually, a combination of the extroverts and introverts together put in work to make those things happen. But it can be extraordinarily lonely without community. I think one of the things that post Mormonism gets criticized about a lot is that we don't have the same kind of community. At least with frequency, we don't.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Of the church. But at the same time, and there's healthy and unhealthy post Mormon communities, but there are healthy post Mormon communities where you can fully belong without an agenda.
Mm.
And where in the church, a lot of the community is contingent on belief affirmation. And if you don't hold the same belief, you're not really part of the community anymore. So it's conditional. And it's not always that, but that tends to be the case. So it takes more work, but it can be deeply meaningful in smaller groups. When I served on the High Council for a period of time, I became really close with the other men on the High Council. We met every week in our stake, and once a month we'd go talk at one of the units. And so in Montana, that usually meant that there was some level of driving, at least sometimes, to.
Sure.
And so we got to know each other and spend time with each other. Or when, like, I was in the young men's presidency years before, we'd take the boys camping, and so I'd have opportunities to spend more time with the men with whom I served. And I missed a lot of those things. Even when I got released from my calling in the High Council, I missed that, because I was programmed to have this community relationship with these men, and then I didn't, because I got a different calling. And so anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, but I'm just want to express that it's different, and community is very important. It was very significant to my healing. It's still a significant part of my sense of identity, is a desire to participate in community. And so I've periodically presented at Thrive conferences and days, things like that, in St. George and at other places. And for most of the years, I've continued to present at the summer Salt Lake City Sunstone Symposium. I didn't last year, but for the multiple years before then, since the year after my faith crisis, I presented there too. And that's been an important part of my journey as well.
How do you prevent the kind of ex-Mormon dogma from entering your communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's conversations in our group. Even though we have over 100 members of our group, usually when we do meetups, it's 15 or fewer that show up. And so that gives us enough time that every single person who comes has an opportunity to participate, and so there aren't people that come and don't get a chance to talk, or they're introverts and get excluded somehow. That doesn't happen. Like, everybody
Sure.
gets a chance to talk. And in our Mormon Spectrum group, about 20% of our members are still active in the church.
Mm.
Um, Whether they're active as non-literal believers or as nuanced believers. And we do have members of our group that attend other Christian churches. We have members of our group that are self-proclaimed atheists or Buddhist Mormons or agnostic, pantheists, just a little bit of everything. So we have the
Sure.
whole spectrum. We actually have had participant members of our group who were active nuance believing. There's a gal that was a temple ordinance worker at nuance believing, and she participated in the group because she had adult children who were LGBTQ, adult
Mm.
children who were super orthodox, black and white thinking believers, and adult children who had completely lost their faith that were angry Exmos.
Right.
And she found it value to participate in our group to better understand the experiences of her children. And so I think, to answer your question, is by having a group that had a spectrum, um, and I think in part because me and the two other co-leaders of the group, both women, are in mixed faith marriages.
Mm.
Um, we had leaders and other members of our group that were modeling uh, mixed faith relationships, that they don't function well without non-dualistic thinking.
Yeah.
And we had a spectrum of people in the group. Um, we had we have a member of our group that for a few years he was serving in a bishopric, not in our stake, but outside of our local stakes,
Oh.
but participated in our group. So it was really helpful. So it was really helpful for people who were the exmo binary thinking to understand why someone would still choose to go to church. Um, it was very helpful to have discussions about how we navigate mixed faith relationships and difficult things like temple marriages and baptisms and ordinations and things like that. Um, to navigate very difficult things like in-laws that are super orthodox believers getting really angry. Um, that was really helpful. I think if my wife had left and lost belief when I did, it would have been harder for me because I wouldn't have been compelled to figure out some of these things. And then I wouldn't have been able to model it as much to our group. So it was just serendipity that were several people in our group that were in mixed faith marriages to be able to model it.
Yeah, again, so serendipitous that this is a part of your story. In a vacuum, it can be really easy to think poorly of people. For example, you could think people that believe in Mormonism are stupid, but it's really hard to call someone stupid when you're face to face with them.
Yeah, particularly if they're thriving and you see that they're making a
Right.
difference in their ward and stake, and they're showing up even as not a McConkie Mormon,
Yeah.
as a David O. McKay Mormon or as a Thomas McConkie Mormon, a faith matters type of Mormon.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's very helpful to see it up close.
Is there any other advice you want to give around building community?
Yeah, I mean, it takes work and patience, and they're online, and Marco Polo can be helpful, and social media can be helpful.
Yeah.
Uh, but in person, my view is that in person relationships are extremely important. And my sense is that over time, uh, whether it's 3% of active believers experience a shift each year or more or less. It's probably more during COVID, and different times it's been less. Enough time has happened now that the vast majority of people know someone that's gone through this in the last decade. And as time goes on, I think there'll be more mentors out there. So even if there's not a community, there can be mentors,
Yeah.
you know, people to go on a hike with or play golf with or go get a coffee or a beer or lunch with or something like that, to just spend some time and not be alone and be able to process things. Um, so I think there's hope. There are places, where there isn't a Thrive or a Mormon Spectrum group, but there are places where there are. So you can go to thrivebeyondreligion.com, or maybe it's .org, and look at their in-person map, and you can go to mormonspectrum.org, and they have in-person support group map. It's probably out of date, but it shows where there at least was something at some point.
Sure.
And if there's not a group, you can create a group. So one of the guys in our group got transferred from Billings to Missoula, which is 5.5 hours away, and he created a group in Missoula. Now they do once a month meetups and have 8, 10, 15 people show up at a time. So you can create one.
Yeah, it almost feels weekly at this point, but it's probably closer to monthly that Claire and I get approached by someone that's in some stage of the deconstruction process. So, what resources are there out there for people like us to mentor people through this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an art to it to an extent, because it depends on what they're processing.
Mm.
And so Luna Lindsay Corbden's book, Recovering Agency, was really important for me. And it's on Audible, and you can buy it in print too, on Amazon. She did a series with Dylan a while back too, or uh, Lindsay's non-binary. That one was really helpful for me to understand the conditioning and recognize it in me. And I've probably gone through Lindsay's book 3 or 4 times. It was so helpful. Um, Eckhart Tolle's book was A New Earth was really helpful. Jack Kornfield's audio program, Buddhism for Beginners, was super helpful. Today, I would say uh, Brett Hartley's book, No Nonsense
Nonsense. True.
Spirituality,
Yeah.
very, very helpful. Um, there were things that were very helpful for me also from ex evangelicals or nuanced evangelicals. So Rob Bell and Rob Bell's podcast, the Robcast, and some of the books that he has written, like Velvet Elvis and Love Wins and Everything is Spiritual and Who Wrote the Bible. Very helpful. Richard Rohr uh, has some really good stuff. Brian McLaren wrote a book called Faith After Doubt that's super helpful even for a non-believer. So there's a whole lot of different things. There are some people who are deconstructing and they need help deconstructing to
Sure.
make sense of things. And so I mean, they can read Rough Stone Rolling, or they can read Dan Vogel's 2 books on Joseph Smith. Um, they can read No Man Knows My History. I would read more than just that one, but that's one that brought about quite a bit of information that gets referenced a lot by Richard Bushman and Rough Stone Rolling.
Yes.
I really like Charles Harrell's book, This Is My Doctrine, The Development of Mormon Theology. He was a BYU professor when he wrote this book, and he goes through all the major core doctrines of the church and talks about how they came to be and evolved over time, and unpacks a lot of information with that in terms of what is priesthood restoration and when did the theology of a Satan character get developed and things like that. Um, So, I mean, it just really depends on where people are at. I suggest Brene Brown stuff quite a bit. Um, there, there was a podcast series called Church is True by Rob Terry that I've suggested people watch or listen to. It's an audio. Um, and I kind of like Mormonism with the Murph podcast. If you want to see kind of a believer who kind of interviews people that are balanced. I think the LDS discussions series for someone deconstructing, super, super strong. So I think it just really depends on where they're at. Like, are they trying to reconstruct meaning? Are they trying to develop non-dualistic thinking? Are they trying to decondition or deprogram things where they don't really realize why they're reacting the way they are to different things, but they can read Luna Lindsay Cobden's book and maybe get a better feel for why that happens.
Okay.
Um, and I like biographies of people from other traditions that
Mm.
have gone through it, like Leaving the Witness, um, or the Book of Separation, um, or Educated. Uh,
Great book. Yeah.
yeah. So, well, that Tara Westover is LDS or was, um, but Amber Scora's Leaving the Witness, Jehovah Witness, was very interesting. There's one by a gal who left the Westboro Baptist Church that was very interesting to read as well. So um, I've read a lot. My Audible queue is always full,
Mhm.
and so is my Kindle queue. Just because I am very curious about things. So I think it really depends on where people are at in their journey as to what is the next thing. So, like when I first read Richard Rohr, I wasn't really ready for Richard Rohr
Mhm.
material. I needed more deconstructive material when I read that. But I was ready when I read Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth.
Oh, that's great. And again, Anthony, really appreciate your time today. Is there anything else that you want to share about the future? What makes you excited? What you're working on? Anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, my experience kind of ebbs and flows where I kind of feel like uh, sometimes it feels overwhelming. It feels like I'm watching a slow moving passenger train wreck where like train car after train car, day after day,
Mhm.
just the trauma and the mess. And it looks like there's no end to it. And sometimes I need to take a break, because I am experiencing some of those things vicariously when I try to support people.
Right.
And then other times, when someone comes to me and they say something like, my relationship with my one man shared with me that he was in his faith transition and his relationship with his father was totally alienated, and his father was his closest friend before, and they
Mhm.
always spent time together and did things, and it was totally alienated, and and he contacted his dad and he said, would you watch a TEDx talk? This guy shared his experience, and he was able to express things that I haven't had words for, but they really resonate with my experience. And his dad said, sure. So his dad watched it and called him like a couple minutes later and said, I'm so sorry. I didn't know that's what you had gone through. And within a week or two, their relationship was totally recovered.
Wow.
And I have experiences like that, and I feel a tremendous sense of gratitude for the opportunity to participate in that. And so it ebbs and flows. Like sometimes I think there's probably a million people that are going to go through this in the next 10 years, and then sometimes I think there are a million people that go through this in the next 10 years. Like that's so much trauma. and so much difficulty and so much grief, and couples don't go through it at the same time usually. Sometimes they do, but not always. And mixed faith marriages and grief and people having a hard time going to work the next day, and and I see the more conservative leadership and members of the church retrenching more and more as more
Mm.
of this happens, and which totally makes sense because they feel threatened and they think it's Satan. A lot of them do think it's Satan that's causing this. And so I don't know. I mean, sometimes I feel really drawn to do what I can to try to participate and relieve suffering. And sometimes I get overwhelmed by it and have people tell me that I've trained a lot of EMTs, to help with the train crash, which is very graceful for them to suggest that.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. I mean, I'm 58 years old. I'm semi-retired. I probably won't ever fully retire. Um, I'm able to do my business about 8 to 10 days a month now, and most of my clients are retired and in their mid 70s, maybe 20 years older than me. So my workload will go down over time as they pass on. Um, so I don't really plan to retire. And sometimes I feel drawn to have discussions like this one. And sometimes I think, I need to take a break. So I don't really know what the future brings. I think the tipping point happened a really long time ago. And what is happening now is inevitable, and there's more that's inevitable. The trajectory started a long time ago. And people that are able to stay in it, like Delenn, for a long time, like there's a cost to that of being exposed to how difficult these things are over an
Yeah.
extended period of time. Um, but there's also really treasured experiences where you find out something that you did um, made relieved some suffering too. So I don't know. Hopefully, I get to travel more, uh, hike more, ride motorcycles, jeeps, rock buggies, and bicycles, and spend time with my dog and my wife, and eat good food.
Well, from a few states away from a stranger that you've held the hand of, your ability to communicate these ideas in the way that you do and be as highly articulate as you are, your efforts do not go unnoticed. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. So,
Yeah.
all the best to you and your wife. And I'm excited to watch your Mormon Stories interview as it premieres tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and we'll talk to you later. Thank you. With that, that does it for this episode of Sacred to Secular. Thank you for tuning in. I'm going to leave Anthony's email in the show notes along with a link to his TED Talk that we talked about today, and a link to his podcast as well. And then, as always, I'll leave my email in the show notes as well for any feedback or anything that you would like to comment about this episode. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.